Hello everyone, today we read and comment the 12th chapter of the 4th book of Von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege. The text follows: the whole action of this pursuit is mainly tactical, and we only dwell upon it here in order to make plain the difference which through it may be produced in the effect of a victory. The first pursuit, as far as the nearest stopping point, belongs as a right to every conqueror, and is hardly in any way connected with these further plans and combinations. This may considerably diminish the positive results of a victory gained with the main body of the army, but they cannot make this first use of it impossible. At least cases of that kind, if conceivable at all, must be so uncommon that they should have no appreciable influence on theory. And here certainly we must say that the example afforded by modern wars opens up quite a new field for energy. In preceding wars resting on a narrower basis and altogether more circumscribed in their scope, there were mainly unnecessary conventional restrictions in various ways, but particularly in this point the conception honor of victory seemed to generals so much by far the chief thing that they thought the less of the complete destruction of the enemy's military force, as in point of fact that the destruction force appeared to them only as one of the many means in war, not by any means as the principal, much less as the only means, so that they more readily put the sword in its sheath at the moment the energy had lowered his. Nothing seemed more natural to them than to stop the combat as soon as the decision was obtained, and to regard all further carnage as unnecessary cruelty. Even if this false philosophy did not determine their resolutions entirely, still it was a point of view by which representations of the exhaustion of all powers and physical impossibility of continuing the struggle obtained a readier evidence and greater weight. Certainly the sparing one's own instrument of victory is a vital question if we only possess this one, and foresee that soon the time may arrive when it will not be sufficient for all that remains to be done, for every continuation of the offensive must lead ultimately to complete exhaustion. But this calculation was still so far false as the further loss of forces by a continuance of the pursuit could bear no proportion to that which the enemy must suffer. That view, therefore, could only exist because the military forces were not considered the vital factor. And so we find that in former wars real heroes, only such as Charles XII, Marlborough, Eugene, Frederick the Great, added a vigorous pursuit to the victories when they were decisive enough, and that other generals usually contented themselves with the possession of the field of battle. In modern times, the greater energy infused into the conduct of wars, through the greater importance of the circumstances from which they have proceeded, has thrown down these conventional barriers. The pursuit has become an all-important business for the conqueror. Trophies have on that account multiplied in extent, and if there are cases also in modern warfare in which this has not been the case, still they belong to the list of exceptions, and are to be accounted for by peculiar circumstances. At Göschen and Bautzen, nothing but the superiority of the allied cavalry prevented a complete rout. At Grossbeeren and Dennewitz, the ill will of Bernadotte, the crown prince of Sweden. At Laon, the enfeebled personal condition of Blücher, who was then 70 years old, and at the moment confined to a dark room owing to an inquiry to his eyes. But Borodino is also an illustration of the point here, and we cannot resist saying a few more words about it, partly because we do not consider the circumstances are explained simply by attaching blame to Bonaparte, partly because it might appear as if this, and with a great number of similar cases, belong to that class which we have designated as so extremely rare, cases in which the general relations seize and fetter the general at the very beginning of the battle. French authors in particular, and great admirers of Bonaparte, Vandacourt, Chambray, Ségur, have blamed him decidedly because he did not drive the Russian army completely off the field, and use his last reserves to scatter it, because then what was only a lost battle would have been a complete rout. We should be obliged to diverge too far to describe circumstantially the mutual situation of the two armies, but this much is evident, that when Bonaparte passed the Niemen with his army, the same corps which afterwards fought at Borodino numbered 300,000 men, of whom now only 120,000 remained. He might therefore well be apprehensive that would not have been enough left to march upon Moscow, the point on which everything seemed to depend. The victory which he had just gained gave him nearly a certainty of taking that capital, for that the Russians would be in a condition to fight a second battle without 8 days seemed in the highest degree improbable, and in Moscow he hoped to find peace. No doubt the complete dispersion of the Russian army would have made this peace much more certain, but still the first consideration was to get to Moscow, that is, to get there with a force with which he should appear dictator over the capital, and through that over the empire and the government. The force which he brought with him to Moscow was not longer sufficient for that, as shown in the sequel, but would have been still less so if, in scattering the Russian army, he had scattered his own at the same time. Bonaparte was thoroughly alive to all this, and in our eyes it stands completely justified. But on that account this case is still not to be reckoned amongst those which, through the general relations, the general is interdicted from following up his victory, for here never was in his case any question of mere pursuit. The victory was decided at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, but the Russians still occupied the greater part of the field of battle. They were not yet disposed to give up the ground, and if the attack had been renewed, they would have still offered a most determined resistance, which would have undoubtedly ended in their complete defeat, but would have caused the conqueror much further bloodshed. We must therefore reckon the battle of Borodino as amongst battles like Bautzen left unfinished. At Bautzen the vanquished preferred to quit the field sooner. At Borodino the conqueror preferred to content himself with a half victory, not because the decision appeared doubtful, but because he was not rich enough to pay for the war. Returning now to our subject, the deduction from our reflections in relation to the first stage of pursuit is that the energy thrown into it chiefly determines the value of the victory. That this pursuit in a second act of victory in many cases is more important also than the first, and that strategy, whilst here approaching tactics to receive from it the harvest of success, exercises the first act of her authority by demanding this complexion of the victory. But further, the effects of victory are very seldom found with this first pursuit. Now, first begins the real career to which victory lent velocity. This course is conditioned, as we have already said, by other relations of which is not yet time to speak. But we must here mention what there is of a general character in the pursuit in order to avoid repetition when the subject occurs again. Alright, so this is the central part of the 12th chapter. That is a bit of a historicistic one, as you understand from Clausewitz fundamentally makes historical examples. To stress an important aspect actually of the pursuit that we've seen the last time in the first part. It is to say that of course we have, he reinforces, as you've heard, the idea that the pursuit is the single most important part of the battle as far as the strategic consequences of it are concerned, right, tendentially, right. But this has to take into account naturally also the feasibility of the same pursuit, or sometimes actually the same annihilation of the troops, the enemy troops that remain on the field before we can wipe them out, right. That could cost to us so much that may not actually be convenient for us in strategic terms to do, right? Which is a sort of exception, right? Albeit it's not really on the same plan of the strategic level, or better, it goes beyond the immediate strategic level for connecting it to a further one. The example of Napoleon at Borodino and his ensuing march on Moscow are very important in this regard, also because they are kind of microscopic events. And von Clausewitz gives it this look by making us understand how there is properly a multi-level dimension that we have to reason like throughout all the battle, not just in tactical terms. That is to say, I'm not here just to win a battle for itself, of course, but this battle is being fought for a specific strategic goal. Well, this strategic goal may vary a lot, not just by how much I manage to destroy the enemy specifically, either in the combat or in the pursuit, but also in how I handle the both things. And we've seen actually that it's very difficult to even pursue it sometimes, because this happens at the very end of a very bloody, messed up situation, which you are exhausted, right, most of the times. So this is particularly difficult to impose, especially to troops that are not so energetic after the battle, and what they would like would be fundamentally to rest, right? But at the same time, we've seen in the previous part of the chapter how this still remains practically the fundamental goal, we could say, of the battle proper, right? And this is not naturally to be disregarded first and foremost. So von Clausewitz says the dual action of this pursuit is mainly tactical, right? We've seen it before, and we only dwell upon it here in order to make plain the difference which through it may be produced in the effect of a victory. Naturally, there is also a strategic pursuit, right? And von Clausewitz will deal with. This is as far as properly the tactical pursuit during the battle, right? After the combat, but not properly after the battle, but after the combat, of this whole act of combat unit, whatever you want to call it, is performed. Von Clausewitz reinforces it to, of course, in the importance of the thing, for the effects produced in a victory. Then he says the first pursuit, as far as the nearest stopping point, belongs as a right to every conqueror, right? This is what you've gone there for. Fundamentally, it's to harvest fundamentally the losses on the enemy. Properly, there is it says, and he's hardly in any way connected with his further plans and combinations, right? It's even something that belongs to the logic of a battle. We can say aside from the strategic results, meaning what specifically? That you would do it anyway, even if you didn't have specifically a goal, right? And this is, as we've seen, this can happen in different ways, because the more you're able to inflict to the enemy in terms of damage, of destruction, of annihilation, and the more you have achieved in the reason of the battle proper that we have seen must bring destruction to the enemy, and there is no way around it, right? Unless it's connected to much broader plans, and this is what can be forced, maybe for in a way, but in other situations may also prevent you to properly press to the first. Says this may, in fact, these plans and combinations may considerably diminish the positive results of a victory gained with the main body of the army, but they cannot make this first use of it impossible. At least cases of that kind, if conceivable at all, must be so uncommon that they should have no appreciable influence on theory. And here certainly we must say that the example afforded by modern wars opens quite a new field for energy. In preceding wars, resting on a narrower basis and altogether more circumscribed in their scope, there were many unnecessary conventional restrictions in various ways, but particularly in this point. The conception, honor victory seemed to generals so much by far the chief thing that they thought the less of the complete destruction of the enemy's military force, as in point of fact that the destruction of force appeared to them as one of the many means in war, not by any means as the principal, but much less as the only means, so that the more they readily put up the sword in its sheath, and the moment the enemy had lowered his. So what does this mean? Well, von Clausewitz here is observing that in past wars, naturally the capacity of pursuit was reduced. Right here, von Clausewitz dialectically makes it another point. It's the critical slash polemical side of the idea that it was a theory mostly of the art of war, is what is concerned here now, that didn't emphasize the importance of the pursuit that we could say in tactical terms is probably the most important action of the battle, as far in terms of properly direct consequences at least. In the past, this was not so easy to achieve, and there is a question of how von Clausewitz is naturally seeing the historical point here, and in my opinion it's very subtle and very deep, because he realizes that in past wars, generally speaking, then here writes, if you remember here now to 18th century examples, as he mostly does, this moment in which things objectively came to a change, substantial change, probably in the theory of the art of war, but also in the practice of warfare, because finally, for reasons that we don't have time to digress on, armies had become more powerful, more complex, also more fluid overall, right? There was a big step forward between the 17th and the 19th century. There is no doubt about this. So what von Clausewitz says here should not be mistaken in an historical perspective with the idea that, in the past, like, I don't know, in the Middle Ages, wherever, things like the honor of the pride of the victor, simply having defeated the enemy was all, namely, what counted, right? The concept of honor of victory. The idea you have defeated your adversary, your enemy, but you haven't killed him, you haven't unleashed this violent destruction on him. The reason here, naturally, is to be, it's partly true, and von Clausewitz himself actually even says, in part, this was true, meaning that there is another part that is not true about this, properly realizing that there was a context for which it was not much impossible in itself, but less frequent to need to want to annihilate the entire enemy army all the time, or in different situations, because the strategical and also the political and social situation may not have wanted you to do the same thing. Naturally, this has to do a lot with the centralization of the modern state, with the fact that eliminating hundreds of thousands of an army, at least putting out of action an army of tens or even 100,000 men, equated to knock out an entire country, a major European country, out of the war. This is something you start seeing only from the 18th and 19th century. We don't have to explain why you didn't see it before, right? Because those powers didn't go as nearly as that to be something centralized. So you could even knock out a royal army. There would be others from the various princes that could raise on their own. So, and even what you could expect in terms of properly, what a war could bring you to, was much less, right? It's very difficult to find massively decisive battles in the pre-industrial times, right? There could be something that naturally could bring to an end much more quickly, or better, much more with much longer consequences, lasting consequences in a way. But for the sheer amount of for the difficulty of replacing resources in this pre-industrial systems, but you will rarely find a battle that was definitive, for which there was no way the defeated could rise once again as a people, especially, right? And there is no surprise that it's exactly among the most advanced countries that this was to be found. Most centralized, kind of state of forms that were appearing, and so on. This is something very well known. Just if you read Machiavelli, or if you think about the just, I don't know, even if you think about the Punic Wars, that's during the second, after all, Carthage was wiped out because it had a very unitary character. So the point here is so to be contextualized, and also for other reasons, considering, for example, the importance of the centrality of the single army. Sometimes it couldn't be overly. Also, the difficulties of command. The unity of command, the lower level of collective training. All things that are rendered more difficult, objectively, just to pursue the enemy so easily. So von Clausewitz says, in this perspective, let's read it in this perspective, nothing seemed more natural to them than to stop the combat as soon as the decision was obtained, and to regard all further carnage as unnecessary cruelty. By the way, I didn't stress also certain other political and social realities that would bring properly to a cultural need of doing this, like especially in fact, the more politically fragmented these realities were, like in tribal warfare, for example. It was not always convenient, for example, to wipe out an enemy, because that could, someone else could be too much benefited by that and could become your next enemy and be even more powerful. So there were ways to regulate warfare, even in this sense. Think also in terms of kind of class belonging to the military, to the knights in the High Middle Ages. There could be, of course, war was always as violent as it could be, but there were certain dynamics that brought these people to fight in ways that contemplated to stop and saying, wait a minute, now we have to think about the future of this. Where do we go? We go with that. And culturally speaking, this produced stop certain, even just ideal rules that, however, in the theorization of warfare, seem to give this false ideal that, even actual warfare of the time was something idealistic, chivalric. It was never, ever anything like that. And if the thing was less bloody than it seemed, which is also very relative, it's for reasons that have to be read in the background of the thing, not in how violent it wasn't warfare, generally speaking, in relative terms, right? So never make this mistake historically. I think of many other examples, right? It's historically speaking, but they are very easy to find. So von Clausewitz is just lamenting the absence of a proper realization, right, objectivization of the need instead to push to the annihilation of battles before his own times, the Napoleonic era, right, where now it was really feasible to do that, and also the political and social background somewhat required it, right? And this came to its apex in many other contexts. Think about during how the rise of the nation state is properly and directly connected to this, because it was an idea, let's knock out an entire country. You have to deliver an enormous amount of power to do that, even for 19th or 20th century standards, before the nuclear times, and all its consequences also politically speaking, right? So it's that you understand what we're talking about. So von Clausewitz writes, even if this false philosophy did not determine their resolutions entirely, so he admits that this is the proof that he's really talking about the theory and not about the reality of warfare. Still, it was a point of view by which representations of the exhaustion of all powers and physical impossibility of continuing the struggle obtain greater evidence and greater weight. Certainly, the sparing one's own instrument of victory is a vital question if we only possess this one, and foresee that soon the time may arrive when it will not be sufficient for all that remains to be done, for every continuation of the offensive must lead ultimately to complete exhaustion. So that in ancient as in modern times, naturally, there is properly a physical limit and a temporal limit, right? You can't pursue forever in a single battle. There is properly a moment, usually the night, where this comes to an end, but there is properly the impossibility of pushing this too further, given the fact that your troops are normally exhausted after a battle, and also you have to commit important troops that may be the last ones you have fresh, so may not be prudent just for the strategical situation. We've seen it in the previous part of the chapter. Von Clausewitz writes, certainly the sparing one's own instrument of victory is a vital question if we only possess this one, and foresee that soon the time may arrive when it will not be sufficient for all that remains to be done, for every continuation of the offensive must lead ultimately to complete exhaustion. Okay, we already read it. But this calculation was still so far false as the further loss of forces by a continuance of the pursuit could bear no proportion that which the enemy must suffer, right? So, as we've seen in previous part of the chapter, yes, there are these limits, but you have always to think that the more you push at that point, tendentially, the much greater the benefit becomes over the cost of you pushing the pursuit further. So, this is in a way the core of the Clausewitzian theory, right? It's the idea that warfare in its own logic should always tend towards the absolute. It's just that reality prevents us to do it. But every time you can do it, you should do it. And this is valid not just for the pursuit, but in an aggressive attacking sense, properly relatively to the attack, to the action proper that you have to do. War should be quick, extremely quick, right? So that there is no and naturally as quick as powerful, right? So that you have to increase the efforts that must be enormous at many levels. Von Clausewitz says that view, therefore, again could only exist because the military forces were not considered the vital factor, right? And this is also important because naturally the military forces before Napoleonic era were more considered in still, let's say, could say aristocratically, right? I think it's a good term of putting it in the sense that, of course, they were not a national statal armies, and they were seen mostly as these agents of kings that played still this kind of sport of war, right? For which it wasn't much about the army itself, right? And the armed forces proper, actually, right? Of the countries that they counted, but just this piece of the country led by the king and this broader monarchic international policy that derived from it. And here, von Clausewitz makes an example stating some of the greatest generals, actually, of the 18th century, that indeed represent also an important step further towards the creation of that state that will become the nation state with the revolutions of the 18th, 19th centuries. Right? We're talking. It's not a coincidence. This is exactly what von Clausewitz means when he says that war is just a prosecution of policy by other means, and that's the point. He says, and so we find that in former wars real heroes only, such as Charles XII, Marlborough, Eugene, Frederick the Great, added a vigorous pursuit to their victories when they were decisive enough, and that other generals usually contented themselves with the possession of the field of battle point. So, what are we talking about? Right, Charles XII, right, the apex of the Swedish Empire. This guy was to wipe out Russia, right, about to, and Sweden would have risen to the stars for that. And you need an army that, the one of the Karoliner, that had never been seen in Europe, right? Charles XII, the Swedish army, Charles XII, was at its own time the strongest army in Europe. So much that he actually lost this whole thing because he got the Russians managed to wear it out before Poltava and then striking, so that Charles XII's army was properly the Schwerpunkt of the campaign of the Swedes for the Russians to act upon. Marlborough here, we're talking about the Glorious Revolution, or the short consequences of it, the rise of Britain as properly a state, a real state, a modern state, and to even empire, into this enormous amount of money that England had never paid to finance a steady, a permanent professional army, right? And that will achieve this very important victories in the wars of coalition, etc. Eugene of Savoy, right? That also didn't quite leave much of a legacy in terms of a structured permanent armed force in Austria, because Austria was still, yet to modernize. It would mostly happen with Maria Theresa in the mid 18th century, as it would happen for Prussia, for example. But still, he set the basis, or the premises for it in many ways. We will see it hopefully in the series on Prince again. And therefore, he also was a great purser in many ways, just like, had been Montecuccoli in the past, and it was prevented by what? By the policy of the Alps. We're saying, no, we don't, now we have to stop, because they had other ideas of how to deal with the Ottomans, right? But here, properly, we see in battles like Zenta, for example, Eugene performing exactly that and delivering this huge blow that, in fact, will make the Austrian conquer an enormous part of Central Europe up to the Balkans. That would be in part even lost, because still, once again, because of the Habsburgic policy. Frederick the Great, right? Prussia is still a second-rate power at the time. It struggles for survival. It actually, was risked to be literally wiped out a couple of times, and the Prussians were just pretty lucky at that point. But once again, because of political reasons, because of international policy. But still, Frederick had realized that in order to survive, of course, Prussia had been modernizing and centralizing since the late 17th century, but with him there is, properly the hyper-functionalization, and especially the statal, political, juridical level, to make Prussia a nation in arms, right? Or at least not a nation, let's say better, but properly said that, let's say, a monarchy functionalized exclusively for the military purpose, right? And always being on the offensive, always being, capable of striking as much as possible in this regard. So it's no surprise that von Clausewitz mentions them. The nation-state in Prussia will exist only thanks to, in part also to von Clausewitz and von Scharnhorst and all the, the nation-state model that the Prussians eventually copied from France. In terms of, at least in which the military forces were orientatively conceived now as probably a national arm. And it took a while before it got to full accomplishment, by the way. There were at least 5 reforms in the process before 1870. Then, says, in modern times, the greater energy infused into the conduct of wars through the greater importance of the circumstances from which they have proceeded has thrown down these conventional barriers. The pursuit has become an all-important business for the conqueror. Trophies have on that account multiplied in extent, and if there are cases also in modern warfare in which this has not been the case, still they belong to the list of exceptions and are to be accounted for by peculiar circumstances. Right. So here repeats what we've seen last time about the and again today with about the necessity of of striking, delivering this great blow, these heavy losses during the pursuit, and he just says it's actually very rare to find a situation in which this does not work, and not only that. But specifically, there are certain indicators now that only it's not only armies that manage to pursue and do it on a regular basis, but there is properly also a multiplication here, and this is very interesting in historical perspective, also beyond von Clausewitz's times, up to our own day, of the trophies of the that indicate how effective the pursuit has been. That is to say, there is also diversification of them, which means that warfare becomes increasingly more complex, and there are different indicators that are not just, as von Clausewitz says, by Napoleonic era, tendentially artillery or prisoners, right? Because that's how he puts that. Here, he admits that the increase of this, the enlargement of this system, the complication of this system, naturally has diversified greatly. Also, the measure by which we can appreciate a victory, which is to be thought of, right? Also in modern times, it is how can you substantiate a defeat? How can you properly think, this battle has been important? By the 19th century, it was much easier than we can see today, albeit there are also other, let's say, properly arms that now have problems, in terms of information, as there have always been. But just they're more varied, and we should be more subtle to interpret them, still remaining objective about it. Now, von Clausewitz starts properly with our historical examples of battles, which this is proven. It says, at Gürschen and Bautzen, in nothing but the superiority of the Allied cavalry prevented a complete rout, right? At Grossbeeren and Dennewitz, the ill will of Bernadotte, the crown prince of Sweden. At Laon, the enfeebled personal condition of Blücher, who has then 70 years old and at the moment confined to a dark room owing to an injury to his eyes. Right, so here we have pretty realistic and also, simple to understand factors that prevented the pursuit at its fullest, right? And you understand that these are, varied. They have to do with the many aspects, many political, moral, even physical reasons, right? So this is not like, this is the theory of the art of war, which is what we're seeing from Clausewitz, is obviously aimed at at a didactic end, right? And yet what happens in practice, in reality, can be very different from that, of course, all the time. And this is probably what we rarely like to remember about warfare, that it's not just about a deterministic reality of what can or can't be achieved practically, if you just want it, but what can happen in terms of even, moral, and especially of moral forces that you can't even properly measure, right? So this is really extremely important in this regard, to understand how everything also strategically or politically related can mitigate the conduct of war at every single time. And it's always contextual, right? It's not a matter of saying, this time I will not myself no, because the system you're trying to manage is so damn complex that you don't even know what the hell is going on, right? And you have to be a freaking military genius to understand, which, guess what, most people are not by the slightest, right? And history teaches this continuously. And this is just, this is understandable just by deepening your knowledge about warfare overall, rather than speculating about it theoretically speaking, which is exactly how instead, von Clausewitz doesn't operate. He looks at the experience and he says, look, this is what happens. This is what you should care about, not what you presume warfare is just because you want to fill the gap of your ignorance with things you invented on the spot. And this is also, by the way, what people mostly do all the time. At least for as far as the non-competent is concerned, right? This is extremely frequent and extremely natural in a way, because human mind is lazy and doesn't even care that someone is trying to explain to you something. The mind said, no, I don't care. I will think on my, well, still good at a level, but you still also build something on your own in alternative. Otherwise, it's quite unlikely you will get anywhere with it in the first place, right? Being skeptical by by the foe is not really a very intelligent thing to do, right? Just like believing to everything everybody says. It's the equivalent, the opposed equivalent in terms of practical use. Von Clausewitz finally goes to the most meaningful example. It's very didactic in this sense. It is the Battle of Borodino, right? And he says, but Borodino is also an illustration to the point here, and we cannot resist saying a few more words about it, partly because we do not consider the circumstances are explained simply by attaching blame to Bonaparte, right? Partly because it might appear as if this, and with a great number of similar cases, belong to that class which we have designated as so extremely rare, cases in which the general relation seize and fetter the general at the very beginning of the battle, right? So what he's saying here is that those exceptions we were talking about before are to be presented here in a sense that, however, are is very pertinent, because Borodino was a huge battle, as you know, in 1812, and it's one of those situations which you can't say, even if it's an exception to the rule, that this doesn't matter structurally speaking, because here there was a pretty sound reason that which von Clausewitz actually agrees with Napoleon, contrarily to the critique that also the same French, let's say, French thinkers had carried out after the Russian campaign. And in fact, von Clausewitz says French authors, in particular, and great admirers of Bonaparte, so also people that were tendentially appreciating what Napoleon did. So he says Vaudancourt, Chambray, Ségur have blamed him decidedly because he did not drive the Russian army completely off the field, and he uses last reserves to scatter it, because then what was only lost battle would have been a complete rout. So what the authors are criticizing is that Napoleon didn't, it's not that didn't properly press on the pursuit, right, but he didn't even mind to annihilate completely the Russian army that, as we will see now, was already defeated, but kept fighting on the field. So these authors said, well, the French had fresh reserves, why don't you use them and wipe out completely the Russians, right? So it says, and use to cause a complete rout, proper, right? So it was about literally wiping them all out. For Clausewitz goes on and says, we should be obliged to diverge too far to describe circumstantially the mutual situation of the two armies, right? So here, for the sake of complexion, in fact, we should have said, okay, what happened after Napoleon let the Russians go in a way, and how this affected the campaign at different levels. Here, von Clausewitz, however, focuses on properly the critique to the tactical employment of these troops, and as we'll see also in a strategic perspective, actually supports Napoleon against this critique. Because it says, but this much is evident, that when Bonaparte passed the Niemen River with his army, the same corps which afterwards fought at Borodino numbered 300,000 men, of whom now only 120,000 remained. He might therefore well be apprehensive that he would have not had enough left to march upon Moscow, the point on which everything seemed to depend. Right? Enormous losses. The victory which he had just gave him nearly certain of taking the capital, for that the Russians would be in a condition to fight a second battle within 8 days, seemed in the highest degree improbable. And in Moscow he hoped to find peace. So here you see there is a broader political point now. We'll see why he wanted to seize Moscow, what the idea was really about. But in terms of his goal, Moscow was properly the object, right? And if, strategically speaking, if he wanted seize that, pressing on the Russians that would have resisted, as you will see now, at Borodino, even after they were defeated, right, with heavy losses anyhow, also from the French side, might have endangered the whole expedition up to that point, right? Because it might have literally lost his entire army at that point, and even increased naturally the Russian capability with the relics of their army to strike back, right? So, von Clausewitz writes, no doubt the complete dispersion of the Russian army would have made this peace much more certain. But still the first consideration was to get to Moscow, that is, to get there with a force with which he should appear dictator over the capital, and through that over the empire and the government. So there's a few to saying here, right? This is not a matter of saying, okay, well, he would have annihilated the Russian army, fine. But what about eventually marching to Moscow, right? If you don't do that, if you don't properly impose yourself on the enemy government in the capital of the empire, it would have been, impossible to even think to achieve anything there. So, Foucault says the force which he brought with him to Moscow was no longer sufficient for that, as shown in the sequel, but it would have been still less so if, in scattering the Russian army, he had scattered his own at the same time. So even without suffering the losses that would have taken to destroy the relics of the Russian army, Napoleon didn't even control properly the city. It was a mess. Even the Russians set it on fire. I mean, it was a dramatic thing. And von Clausewitz says Bonaparte was thoroughly alive to all this, right? He knew what the problem was about. And in our eyes, his stance completely justified. At least, he failed, but at least he tried its best, right? He didn't simply say, okay, we have just to now consider this tactical engagement as detached from the strategic objectives. It's a very bad mistake, right? And a pretty serious one, in something here that can be measured concretely, right? Because not even with the forces that he eventually got later managed to do what he hoped to do. So you can imagine even with less forces. And von Clausewitz writes, on that account, this case is still not to be reckoned amongst those in which through the general relations, the general is interdicted from following up his victory, for there never was in his case any question of mere pursuit. Right? The victory was decided at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, but the Russians still occupied the greater part of the field of battle. They were not yet disposed to give up the ground, and if the attack had been renewed, they would still have offered the most determined resistance, which would have undoubtedly ended in their complete defeat, but would have cost the conqueror much further bloodshed. We must therefore reckon that the Battle of Borodino, as amongst battles like Bautzen, left unfinished, right? And left unfinished in this case, for a good reason. At Bautzen, the vanquished preferred to quit the field sooner. At Borodino, the conqueror preferred to content himself with half a victory, not because the decision appeared doubtful, the decision of the battle. The Russians had lost, but because he was not rich enough to pay for the wall. This is a very way of phrasing it, by the way. And then von Clausewitz says, concluding, returning now to our subject, the deduction from our reflections in relation to the first stage of pursuit is that the energy thrown into chiefly determines the value of the victory. Thus, this pursuit is a second act of the victory, in many cases more important also than the first, and that strategy, whilst here approaching tactics to receive from it the harvest of success, exercises the first act of her authority by demanding this complexion of the victory. That is to say, normally, this is what you have to do, pursuing to the fullest, but still it's exactly the strategic situation that dictates what may be convenient or not in the end, right? So it's quite important to stress. But further, he writes also, the effects of victory are very seldom found to stop, in fact, with this first pursuit. Now first begins the real career to which victory lent velocity. This course is conditioned, as we have already said, by other relations of which it is not yet time to speak. But one must here mention what there is of a general character in the pursuit in order to avoid repetition when the subject occurs again. Right? So, I think this is pretty clear, right? Von Clausewitz has shown us an example that reveals the constant connection of historical, historically based, by the way, and on such a good example case was Borodino. And eventually we'll go on because the final part of the chapter is dedicated to this trifold stage of the pursuit. That is also quite fascinating. But this historicistic example, I think, is fine because it gives both an idea of what and why things changed over time, and also how even some of the largest battles ever. So the ones in which von Clausewitz himself is saying, most the tendency should be even the more, right, for increasing the pressure, in the case of pursuit, are still tied unavoidably to the strategic goal, right? And this cannot be unsolved. I think it's not something you can, or better, you can, but with devastating consequences. And if Napoleon had pressed on the Russians, Borodino, at this point, we wouldn't even talk about his occupation of Moscow, all the eventual stages, but much less, right? He would have been obliged to fundamentally come back, very likely. So, aside from this, we stop it here. So next time we'll hopefully conclude the chapter. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.